So this is a submission for assignment 4.2 for New Testament Theology with Professor Philip Brown. My name is Peter Westerman. And so for the I am statements, I chose John 8:12, which says, "When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, 'I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life.'" So Jesus is talking about a couple different things here, and he goes on to further explain, but not as you might expect based on that passage alone. Um, but what we know is that John talks about Jesus being the light in other occasions as well. So this week we read from 1 John, and in 1 John chapter 1, 5 through 6, Jesus or John is saying about Jesus and his message. He says, "This is the message we have heard from him and declare to you: God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. And if we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth." And so we see that there's this theme of Jesus, of God being the light in the world, and that in him there is no darkness. So he is just pure light. And so here Jesus is speaking of himself, that he is the light of the world. And he states a call for people to follow him, promising them to have the light of life. So I thought it would be appropriate to try to figure out, what is the light of the world? What does that mean? And I think that when Jesus is talking about being the light of the world, uh, he means that by being the light of the world has no other light than him. Um, Everything else aside from him is darkness, and it's either Jesus or darkness. You have no other option. So you're either in the light or you're in darkness. There's no third option. Um, Also, I think that it means that the all the world and everyone in the world needs light. Then Jesus is their light. Um, so if you don't have light, then you're stumbling around the darkness, and so there's this need for light. Um, Third, I think that it means that I think that the world is made for light. I think that everything that is not of God is sinful, is evil and wrong, and so the world was created originally without sin, and was created for light and was created for good. So anything that's not of light is foreign and is not of the created world. To differentiate between being worldly um, and being of God's intended created world. So um, yeah, I think that when this light comes out, it makes the things that are evil and of dark and sinful nature very evident. They're illuminated by this light, and it kind of reveals the beauty of the created world that God intended us to be a part of, and that light. And I think the other thing that the light of the world can mean is that one day when Jesus comes and reigns, and he will spread his light over all the world, and there will be no more darkness. There will be no more sin. And the way that the world was intended to be will finally be that. And that's why he refers to hell as the outer darkness, because the darkness will no longer exist on earth, but instead be pushed to hell. And that's where Satan will go, and all of his followers will go to the outer darkness or to hell, and only light will remain on earth, which the reign of Christ. But what's interesting is, and it almost seems like a detraction from what Jesus is saying here, is that the Pharisees don't respond to this light of the world concept almost at all. Instead, in John 8:13, the Pharisees challenge him and they say, "Here you are, appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid." And so what they're doing here is they're using Jesus' own logic against him. If you look back in John chapter 5, verse 31, Jesus says, "If I testify about myself, my testimony is not true." And so the Pharisees are saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. You're calling yourself the light of the world and being your own testimony to that. So your own words say that you can't do that. And if you do, then you're false and you're wrong. So you just proved yourself wrong." But it's interesting because that's not what Jesus is actually saying here. So they're taking it out of context. And what Jesus is actually getting at in his response to them is to stop talking about being the light of the world, but then to just illuminate his relationship to the Father instead. So he begins to respond in verses 14 and 15 by saying that his claim to be from the light of the world is not from himself, and of himself. It's from the Father. And as he is, I am, he calls himself I am, um, then the claim is from the Father onto him and through him, and he is just recognizing a claim that's been given to him from the Father. But as he is of God and from God and going back to God, then it's not a self-testifying claim. It's a claim that's fulfilled through that. Um, Instead. And John Piper has an interesting kind of analogy to try to explain what's going on here. And he explains, he says, if I had been heard, this is his words, he goes, if I had been heard to say, I never use the word torch, and then you heard that, you heard me say that, and then a couple days later, you're lost in a dark tunnel and you can't find your way out. And then I come along and I have a light source, and I hand it to you and I say, here, take my torch and it'll help you get out of this dark tunnel. And instead of taking the torch from me, you say, I heard you yesterday or a couple days ago say that you don't use the word torch. And now you're saying that you have a torch. So therefore you must not have a torch. But would he then go back and say, well, when you heard me say that, I was talking about how in England, British people don't call flashlights flashlights, they call them torches. And I was just saying that I don't call them torches, I call them flashlights. So I don't use the word torch. So it's like obviously just taking out of context, and instead of recognizing that he's offering them a way out, a way to salvation, a way out of this dark tunnel, they're just disregarding the light entirely and going off of trying to argue with him and trying to um, undercut his authority there. So I just love that analogy from John Piper. So that's um, my I am recording.